It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Hannah Roussel to our special segment of Talmud for Everyone called Two Scholars and a Talmud. Hannah Roussel recently completed her PhD in the History Department at the University of Michigan. Go Blue! She has an MA in Talmud and Rabbinic Literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, a BA in Judaic Studies from the University of Michigan. She is a self-proclaimed Talmud nerd, disability rights activist, and enjoys plenty of geeky activities in her downtime. That is, when her two cats are not monopolizing her attention with demands to be treated like royalty, which they admittedly are. Hannah, welcome to Two Scholars in the Talmud. Thanks for doing this. Mazal tov, kol hakavod. Congratulations, first of all, on the obtention of your PhD at the University of Michigan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Mazel tov to you and everyone else on the Talmud for Everyone team for getting this for expanding what Talmud for Everyone is, and to you especially for making this YouTube channel. It's really exciting and I'm happy to be able to be a part of it.
Well, I'm delighted you're here to talk about your cutting edge, new, innovative research. We know each other since our time at the University of Michigan when I was a doctoral student myself, working as a TA, or as they call it at Michigan, GSI, graduate student instructor. And you were in one of those classes that I was GSIing for. So years later, here we are now, both with PhDs. And we're going to do Talmud Torah, learning Torah together, have a conversation around your dissertation, which examines the rabbinic concept of Chulshat Da'at, which can be translated into English as something like weakness of mind. So you examine this phrase in the Babylonian Talmud through the lenses of disability, mad, gender, and environmental studies. How did you become interested in writing a dissertation on this topic?
Yeah, it's kind of a circuitous path that I took to get to get here. My whole life, or my whole academic life for the most part, I thought I was gonna do just like gender and women's studies. It got time to pick a topic for my dissertation, and I realized that all of my personal burning questions about women and gender and the Talmud had already been answered by other brilliant scholars. Not that there's still, I want to say there's still so much to be done in that topic and that field of studies, but my personal questions, I felt like other people already answered them. And I was like, okay, well, what am I going to write my dissertation about? And I was actually in a seminar with Sarah Lev, who was there as a guest professor at the University of Michigan for a semester. And um, we were studying some rabbinic texts together in class, and we came across the term shoteh, which a lot of people translate simply as fool. But turns out it's actually really the rabbis, when they use the term shoteh, are referring to someone with some sort of intellectual or developmental disability. And I remember sitting there in the classroom and being like, one, how offensive that we're just translating this as fool. That's some ableist language, old school translation that we need to update. Secondly, how do I have a master's in Talmud and rabbinic literature and not know this? Um, and I was going to write my whole dissertation about the topic shoteh. Um, and that got me into disability studies. And as I was looking um, and studying this topic and um, like doing more research and learning more on disability studies, I realized it was so important to try to uplift voices of people who are disabled in the past or present, whoever we're studying, to uplift their own voices and their own descriptions of their experiences. And I was like, okay, well, I work with the Talmud. How can I get to that? And I didn't quite get there, but I got a little close with the Hulshat Da'at, as I call them, stories, where Hulshat Da'at, as you said, it can be loosely translated to weakness or illness of mind. Um, and it almost always happens to a rabbi in these stories. So we're still not getting that rabbi's perspective. But it's like, okay, this is a text by rabbis, probably written largely for rabbis. Like maybe this is a little bit closer to getting at actual people's voices who've had this experience. Um, and I was gonna do just a chapter on these stories, and pretty soon it became my whole dissertation. And in the process, right, Hulshat Dad isn't as obviously like people might say illness, weakness of mind, is that a disability? Well, it depends. It could be, depending on the person's experience. And that's also what got me into MAD studies, which has a lot of overlap and intertwining with disability studies.
Which is actually one of the next questions I wanted to ask you, but I totally understand how challenging it is to find a dissertation topic.
Yeah.
At that stage, you finish your coursework, you pass your, what, Michigan, I think they call them prelims,
Yeah.
or comprehensives. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. And
Uh-huh.
I had the three different ideas. One of them was actually also on women and gender. I was thinking
Well,
of
that's great.
seriously contemplating writing about jewelry. I thought jewelry was a fascinating topic. You have the material culture. There's a whole bunch of
Ah,
right? Jewelry that has been discovered, excavated, and compare that with the texts, Jewish and ancient Christian texts. But anyways, I eventually went into an entirely different direction. But
yeah,
finding a dissertation topic is challenging in its own right.
yeah.
Uh, but so for viewers who might not be familiar with disability studies and MAD studies, can you explain what these studies are?
Yeah, so it's along similar veins as like women's studies, race studies, queer studies. Um, but and just as, I don't know if people might be more familiar with, in women's studies, how we talk about the fact that, gender and even biological sex are social constructs. We are cultural constructs, and that we choose to label certain bodies as women and men, or male and female. um the same for race, like we choose to categorize people by the colors of their skin. And if you look throughout history, I'm by no means a scholar of race, but you look throughout history, and like definitions of whiteness and blackness and other races like shift and change through time. They're not ontological. They're culturally and socially informed. And the same is true for disability, and also madness. I know mad is a hot controversial term. We'll get to that in a second. I want to talk about disability first. So disability studies recognizes that just as much as a disability can be a physical reality that someone experiences, a lot of what defines a person's disability is the society and culture in which they live. The like basic example that is like probably overused is if someone is a wheelchair user, but we exist in a world that always has ramps and elevators and ways for that person to get around in a wheelchair, are they then disabled? Like if we choose to build buildings and curbs without curb cuts that have these barriers, we in the way that we're like literally building our surroundings, we're making life harder for some people, and we're like almost putting that disability on them. Another common example is glasses. I wear glass. A lot of people wear glasses, but we don't necessarily think of it as a disability because how much does it affect your daily life and what you can or cannot do? Um, So yeah, I hope I does that make sense how disability is a cultural and social construct in many ways?
And I think so. Disability studies is also a critical engagement with what we think is a disability or not, is what I'm gathering from what you've just said.
Yeah, and there's also a sense of Julia Watts-Belser does a really great job of this, of studying disability as a form of culture. And oh, how do I phrase this and phrase it well? She could state it much better than I could. But not only is disability culturally constructed in many ways, but it's also um people who are disabled have like their own cultures themselves and their own communities that are like worthy of study and perspectives that are worthy to listen to. So that kind of is like a very broad definition, but maybe gives you a sense of what people in disability studies are doing.
Okay, I get it. So, what about math studies then? You said you're going to talk
Yeah.
about that. How is that different from, or does it overlap somewhat with disability studies?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a wonderful question. Yeah. So mad studies is a much more recent academic field. It came out in the early 2000s. And it's unique as an academic field, and then it grew out of an activist movement, the anti-psychiatry movement. And so these are people who, a lot of people in the anti-psychiatry movement are people who were mistreated by modern day mental health systems that are supposed to help them. We see it in horror movies all the time, people who are institutionalized and then abused. There's a reason people think that old asylums or mental hospitals are great places to go on ghost hunts. Right? There's this, and it actually might be a bit of a bad form to do those ghost hunts, but and to like sensationalize actual lived traumatic experiences. But there is this like acknowledgement, even in like the entertainment and Hollywood area of our culture, that we don't always treat people with mental illnesses very well. Um, and the anti-psychiatry movement is pushing back against that and reclaiming people's agency. It's also pushing back against the pathologization. Am I pronouncing that word right?
It sounds right to me. Yeah.
When you're a scholar and you read things but don't say them often.
Yes.
Right, you don't pathologize it. You don't like just because I'm experiencing um a certain lived experience, does that mean we automatically need to call it an illness? Um, there's also been a lot of times in history where like um colonists have come in and like, for example, with Native Americans, like institutionalized them for quote unquote mental illnesses, when really it's just a way to force them to conform to like Western society and to into a race indigenous culture. Um, that's not my area of expertise in mad studies, but right, that's a whole section of it. But that's also not to say that people don't benefit from the psychiatric system. I myself see a psychiatrist and take the medicine he prescribes me. And so what's beautiful about the mad studies community is that they've got this idea that it can be a little bit of both and they talk about like consumers, survivors, and ex-psychiatric patients. And this like thing called like C/S/X, or I might have the order mixed around, but there's this idea that like someone can benefit from it. Like I have ADHD. The medication I get from my psychiatrist helps me focus. It empowers me. It helps me function. But someone else who's been institutionalized against their will and their agency taken away from them is going to have a really traumatic experience with the modern day psychiatric system. And so there's this wonderful recognition that like both truths can exist at the same time. Um, and there's been a lot of reclaiming the term mad in favor of mental illness. Because there are times when people say, is this really an illness or is it just a non-normative way of being that people want to pathologize? And so it's still like a in some ways a tense term. Some people still don't prefer mad because it was a derogatory term used against people deemed as having mental illnesses for a long time historically, but other people in the community are taking the term and reclaiming it as like a positive identifier now. Um, and I myself find taking the word mad as a very useful analytical tool and concept in my own research because it does remove our modern day, um, you know, medical view of things and allow me to try to study, well, what did these ancient rabbis think? Um, and it's a way to help try to remove that modern lens so I'm not anachronistically diagnosing into the past.
I see. And as you were talking, since I mean, you are in the Ann Arbor area, a little anecdote. Once there was an invited professor in rabbinics, and I went as a PhD student eagerly to pick up this scholar at the airport, not
Yeah.
too far away. And we're driving back, and we passed by Ypsilanti, and the scholar said Ypsilanti, and referred to this incident of the I think it was three people who were in I don't know if it was an asylum, I don't know, a hospital or what it was, but each one of them thought they were Jesus.
Mm.
And the psychiatrist in question put them all together against their will to see how they would respond to one another, and later recognized that what he had done was unethical. But this story was just crossing my mind as you were talking about mad studies. I think there's even a book or some article on this, the three Jesuses of Ypsilanti, something like that. I don't know if
Oh,
you've
wow.
incident, but you can search for it on Wikipedia later on. But moving on to the rabbinics side, therefore, because what you're doing is with your research, taking these contemporary, very recent approaches, at least with mad studies, rather recent, and applying it to the study of early rabbinic literature. You already stated earlier that Hushat Dat can mean several things like weakness of mind or illness of mind. However, in your dissertation, and we don't want to give away too much information, right? Because your dissertation's under an embargo for the time being.
Yeah, I'm holding it close to the chest while I work on some articles.
I completely understand. What are some other meanings maybe of this phrase, and who experiences Hushat Da'at in the Babylonian Talmud? You mentioned some sages do. Are there other people who experience Hushat Da'at or are referred to as experiencing this thing? And under what circumstances and why?
Yeah, thank you. I think there was a little bit of a cameo. One of the cats that
There-
you mentioned in my bio is making a guest appearance.
there's a French comic which I really like, a comic book series called Le Chat du Rabbin, the Rabbi's Cat, which I highly recommend.
Oh, yes.
It's a rabbi has a cat. This cat can talk and can study Talmud too. So I guess Talmud for everyone includes cats.
Includes cats.
Have a
Yes.
cat on the show.
I have a friend who studies disability in the Old Testament, and we always joke about our cats having little bait midrashes where they study Talmud together. Um, anyways, um, back on track. What were we?
Yeah, so
Oh,
just like Hulsha Da'at in the Babylonian Talmud, who experiences this, under what circumstances and why?
yeah, yeah. I For the viewers at home, when I look when I look away, I'm looking at my second screen that has my notes on it. Um, yeah, so Hulshat Da'at, I mean, Hulshat is like this noun form that means illness or weakness. Halash, to become ill, to become weak. Da'at is there isn't a direct translation into English. It can mean mind, it can mean opinion, it can mean knowledge, as a few of the various things it can mean. Um, and a lot of times it gets translated as kind of like an expression, but maybe not a very serious thing. Like people are like, can you really read this as madness, Hannah? But one of the main methodologies, I guess, or questions of my dissertation is what if we take what the rabbis are saying at face value? They're saying his mind became weak, his mind became ill. Well, if we take that for what it's saying and read the story, or the passage, there are a few times it's not a story, but mostly they're stories. Um, you know, does it work to read it that way? And what historical insights can we glean from reading it that way? And also people who say this don't like madness doesn't have to be some great extreme. Madness doesn't mean I'm stuck in bed all day for days on end because I'm severely depressed. It can mean that. But like again, I'm very open as a disability advocate. I'm very open about my own experiences and identities. I take this medication that's combo anti-anxiety, anti-depression medication. Um, there was a time in undergrad where I was uncontrollably crying in public and I had to like start going to see a therapist and figure out what was going wrong. Uh, and maybe in that sense, yes, people might read that as like, oh, that's madness, that's a mental illness, that's a disability because I wasn't able to be in public because I would just start crying. It was not a fun experience for me. But after years of like, working with health professionals and family and self-exploration, um, I'm not that way anymore, but I still take my anti-anxiety medication. Am I still mad or aren't I? Where do you draw the line? I think I'm still mad. That's a badge I wear proudly. I'm a neurodiverse human in a few different ways. And I think it's something to be proud. It gives me a different perspective from someone else. It gives me different strengths and different weaknesses. And so when you look at Hulshat Da and say, weakness of mind, and you're like, and you look at the rabbis that are experiencing this and saying, okay, well, it's not debilitating weakness of mind, so can we really call it madness? I think mad studies would say, yes, we still can. Um, if that's the way that person, or in the case of the Talmud, the way the story is describing this person's experience,
Mhm.
then we should take what they're saying. Um, that's I kind of got a little bit off topic because we also wanted to talk about who's experiencing this cool shot dot or this form of madness. And I originally said like it's mostly the rabbis, the sages themselves. Sometimes it's um past historical figures even to the rabbis that they've then taken as like proto rabbis. Like there's this story in the Talmud about Choni who lived in the Second Temple period and was kind of this like miracle worker and bringer of rain. And the rabbis very much describe him as a rabbi, even though he wasn't, but they've like kind of claimed him as their own. And so sometimes you get these sorts of figures too.
Mhm.
Um, three times that I've been able to find, the person experiencing Hulshat Da is a woman. And two of those times that woman is human. The third, it's the moon. But the moon is
The moon is a
described.
the moon is a woman.
The moon is a woman. Yeah, it's she's she's described with she her pronouns, and she's often when the rabbis are talking about the phases of the moon, they often use the imagery of a pregnant woman.
Okay.
So like and I'm gonna embarrass myself because I don't remember moon terminology. But
Mhm.
like I think a full moon is when you see all of the moon in the sky, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
One one big silver circle. That's a woman. There's one passage in the Talmud where they describe her as like, oh, a pregnant woman whose belly is between her teeth. And
Mm,
what they mean is she's so pregnant that her belly is like coming up.
I see.
It's kind of this like comical exaggeration of an image. And then is it a new moon where you don't see anything?
Right.
And that's they describe that as a woman who's just given birth.
Huh.
So they like kind of talk about the phases of the moon. They use the metaphor of a woman's pregnant belly. And grammatically, the moon is feminine. Um, so yeah, so once they talk about the moon, and two times it's a human woman who experiences Hulshadat. And that's kind of where the gender studies comes into play in my dissertation, is we're looking at Hulshat Dot kind of very much emerges as a very specific type of madness experience. Um, that I think, my hypothesis that I hope I argue well in my in my dissertation, is that it seems that social status is really at play here. And I think that's why you mostly see rabbis or proto-rabbinic, according to the rabbi's characters, experiencing it, is you have to have a high social status already in order to have fallen from your social status or to have your social status threatened. And those are the moments where we tend to see people experiencing Hulshat Dat in the rabbinic texts, is when their social status is under threat or has been taken down a peg or two.
Okay, and we're going to discuss two passages today for the rest of our segment from the Babylonian Talmud that you discuss in your dissertation, but also in an article, a paper that you presented at the Association of Jewish Studies.
Mhm.
Um, the first one is from Tractate Ketuvot, right? So the Babylonian Talmud for our viewers or listeners is divided into tractates. So this is just like one section within the Talmud called Ketuvot 62b. We might also provide this text and translation later on in the link in the description below this interview. But let's just go ahead and maybe start reading this passage together, discuss it, and you can show us how you read this text. So this is your translation of this passage. I'm going to just start reading it. Quote, this is similar to Rav Rehumi, who was frequently found studying before Rava at Mahoza. Rav Rehumi would regularly return to his house, and you put that in quotation marks, that is his wife, each Yom Kippur Eve. One day, he was pulled in by his studies and did not return home. His house watched for him. Now he is coming. Now he is coming, she said. He did not come. Her mind became ill, and here in the Hebrew we have halash da'ata. So
Yeah,
at almost like I guess a technical term which you're analyzing in your dissertation
yeah,
on Talmud. She let one tear fall from her eye. He, that is her husband, was sitting on a roof. The roof broke beneath him, and his spirit rested, meaning he died. So you translate here the Aramaic term. So the text actually is in Aramaic. The Talmud is a bilingual text, right? In Aramaic and
yeah,
Hebrew, it goes back and forth. So in the passage that we're reading, we have the term beiteh, literally his house instead of his wife. And you decide to provide a literal translation. Often
yeah,
readers who are reading these texts in English translation will encounter, I believe, wife rather than house, but you've deliberately chosen to keep house as the literal translation of the Aramaic. So what's the connection here between house and wife? And the same word can also mean uterus, correct?
Yes, yeah. So that's what's great. Again, like I said earlier, I think a lot of my like methodology for the dissertation was like, let's think about these words that are being used and what they really mean and what they're saying on multiple levels. Um, and so, in the Babylonian Talmud, the phrase, Beta, his house, was used to mean his wife. And so often, I think, as you already said, like translators will just translate it as his wife, but you're losing some of the nuance when you do that. And we'll see this even more so in the second story, but the rabbis are really playing with all the different meanings of Bait, house. And in this story, rabbis love wordplay, as anyone who studied even a tiny bit of the Talmud knows. And or other rabbinic literature. And there's something like really important going on here. So um sorry, gathering my thoughts.
Right. No, as you're gathering your thoughts, I
Uh,
did find that translation refreshing to see house. Because even for readers who encounter the text in the original language, I think in Aramaic or in Hebrew, sometimes we just gloss over that. I'll admit myself, oh yeah, bait, beiteh, his house, that means his wife. I know that, and I move on. But I was struck by your rendition into English of house. It really makes one pause and be like, wait a minute, house? Why does it say house? Oh yes, the wife here is being designated as house. What I also found interesting and refreshing about your dissertation is you give names, personal names to many of the women who are unnamed in the
yeah,
Talmud, because for the most part, women are not named in the Talmud, correct? And so here
correct.
is Rav Rahumi, who's just designated as Rav Rahumi's house. You gave a name to her, Yael, right? So can you explain your decision to provide names to the anonymous woman in the Talmud?
Yeah. That was actually my advisor, Rafe, Raphael Nice. That was their idea. And I loved it and I ran with it. Um, and because I was like still learning. I was like, can I do that? Can I just give someone a name that's like not historically accurate? Um, but with my advisor's permission, I was like, okay, yeah, we're gonna do this. Um, and I think it's a really important, um, I guess like you could say political move in helping reclaim these women's agency. And so when I chose the names for them, I wasn't necessarily trying to choose the most historically accurate name. I mean, I kept the names Jewish. I Tal has these like this great multi-volume work that like catalogs Jewish names in late antiquity. That was like very helpful too. But in the end, I chose names for them for these women that kind of highlighted important aspects of them and also like just gave some agency back to these women whose names were not preserved in history. And so I chose to name her Yael because if people are familiar with Yael in the biblical story in Judges, um, one of my favorite Bible stories, I must say. Devorah or Deborah, who's a prophet, leads leads Israel in battle. Well, Barak leads it, but Devorah tells Barak to lead Israel in battle. And the enemy commander is fleeing and Yael is part of this nomadic people that lived in the desert through which, and their territory was through which this enemy commander was fleeing. And she invites him, she decides to side with Israel and invites him into her tent saying, I'm going to give you refuge. But instead, she feeds him more milk and puts him to sleep, and then takes a tent peg and a hammer. And I guess it's kind of gruesome, but she like nails the tent peg through his head and kills him. Um, this enemy commander who was attacking Israel. And so there's this great feminist reading of, some people say she actually is taking the tent peg that's being used for her own tent, and she's like toppling the house in which she's been contained. And unfortunately, when I was doing my dissertation, I went back and was reading, and I was trying to find what scholar originally said this, and I apologize that I couldn't find it, but I remember reading it in an undergrad class. Um, and so anyways, there's this idea of Yael like turning gender norms on their head and toppling the house. She's this quote unquote housewife, but she literally takes the tent peg and and probably historically she just had a spare tent peg lying around. But the imagery of her pulling one out that's holding the tent and toppling the tenter for her house, is this great like metaphor of her transgressing gender norms and saving the Israelites. Um, and so I named the woman in this story Yael after her because she also topples some houses. In the sense that Rav Rehumi is most likely sitting on the roof of the Beit Midrash, which means study house. That's where the rabbis would go to study their Torah. It's still today a place where you can go hang out and study Torah, though
Mhm.
Baruch Hashem, most Beit Midrashes are egalitarian these days, and they're not male-only spaces. Um, but the roof breaks from underneath him and he falls to his death, and that's also in a way a toppling of a house and her transgressing the physical house in which she is bound and waiting.
Which I had a question about that,
Yeah,
and maybe before I ask that question, just for the listeners, viewers, to discuss some of the other aspects of this story, because we have here a rabbinic sage who is absent from home, to say the very least. I'm
yeah,
thinking I'm thinking of Daniel Boyarin's phrase "married monks" to describe
yeah,
rabbis. He's always studying. When he does come home, it's on the eve of Yom Kippur, and that's precisely when you start to abstain, amongst other things, from sexual intercourse, right?
yeah,
Uh, Sexual intercourse is forbidden on Yom Kippur according to rabbinic halacha. Uh, so this is something he's presumably obliged, however, to provide to his wife according to rabbinic law, right? Sexual
yeah.
relations. So, but they're never engaging in any sexual intercourse if he's away the entire year, and then when he does come back, the only day he's back is on Yom Kippur, right?
Yeah, yeah. So this story actually comes right after or amidst a rabbinic discussion about a husband's obligation to his
Oh,
wife.
okay.
And yeah, one of the I think I looked at the Talmud it's on Ketubot page 62b. It's in the midst of a discussion of Mishnah Ketubot 5:6, which lays out how often a husband is obligated to sexually satisfy his wife based on his career. I mean, the idea is that if you have a career where you're at home every night, then you're obligated daily to give your wife sexual pleasure. If you have a job that means you have to travel a lot, then the obligation of how frequently you have to, pleasure your wife in this way, it goes down how often you have to do it. Um, the Mishnah states students may leave their homes and travel in order to learn Torah without their wife's permission for up to 30 days. So they can only like leave without their wife's permission for up to 30 days. And then they've got to either get her permission or go back home and have sex with her because they can't just leave her alone. And it like consensual sex, hopefully.
So
And
he's
in the
transgressing, I'm sorry, he's transgressing the rabbinic halacha then, right?
yeah, yeah, he is. In the Talmud, they extend this a little bit and they say that students may leave their homes to study Torah for as long as 2 or 3 years without permission from their wives. But then they bring these stories. There's actually a bunch of stories, one after the other, about rabbis like neglecting their wives and their homes and their children. And there's like the stories are dealing with this tension of Torah versus familial obligations. Um, yeah, and this story is kind of being told as like what's the term? It's the same as like fairy tales, like Red Riding Hood teaches little kids not to wander in the woods alone. This is like teaching rabbis, don't neglect your wife, she'll get sad and you'll die.
Right, which is I'm wondering, is he divinely punished or I mean, what do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think you can read it that way, and I'll get into it a little more. But what was striking for me and what I tried to maintain in my translation was how much Yael's agency is preserved and highlighted in the way this story is told. Um, I mean, at first, she's a little passive. We're not even, it's just we're hearing about Rav Rahumi. He was frequently found studying in Machoza. He would regularly return to his house slash wife each Yom Kippur Eve when he couldn't fully be with her because he couldn't have sex with her. Um, One day he was pulled in by his studies, and finally we hear more about his wife and what she's experiencing.
Oh.
His house washed for him. So there's like this active verb. And then she speaks, we hear her voice. Now he's coming. Now he's coming. He did not come. And the Talmud, a large part of the Talmud is passed down orally. And when there's repetition, it's very pointed because when you're passing things down orally, you abbreviate it, say things more succinctly. So the fact that she's repeating, now he is coming, now he is coming, that's like a very deliberate choice that's being made here. And you really can like feel her yearning and her emotions in that moment. And then we have her mind became ill, chalash da'ata. And then there's this very agentive phrase of, I didn't preserve the Aramaic in my translation, but it says she let one tear fall from her eye. It's not one tear fell from her eye. And so I really tried to like keep that active verb in the way I translated it. Um, and there seems to very much be this cause of effect. Her mind becomes ill, the tear falls, and just as the fell, so too the roof falls from under him. Now, I think there is some divine action at play in here, but it's very much tied up in the woman's actions as well. Um, there are lots of stories that you'll find in the Talmud and where a rabbi becomes like super sad or distressed and God responds with almost an over exaggeration. Um, there's this great story where one rabbi starts to remove his shoes in distress, and he removes, because the world's in famine, he removes one shoe and it starts to rain so that produce can grow. He starts to remove his second shoe, and Elijah appears before him. Elijah in the Talmud kind of becomes this like almost like what today might be an angelic figure of like, the rabbis know he's not alive anymore, but he'll like appear before someone and like uh uh give them a warning or a direction or something.
I call him
And
the Jewish Santa, you know,
Jewish, yes, yes, because it's
angry
those
Santa.
Santa-esque stories.
Sometimes Santa can be angry. Elijah can be angry when he appears to you, but
Yeah, yeah, it's like those the Christmas movies where the character, you didn't realize he was Santa all along and he walks away in the snow, but suddenly you don't see his footsteps anymore, right? Like um That's kind of what Elijah
She went
does
to
in the.
heaven, like not on a chariot, not with reindeer, but still a chariot
Oh
of.
my God, I love it. I love the comparison to Santa.
I interrupted you there, and your point was basically talking about how, in this story that we're studying together, we have what we're going to call her Yael. She decides she lets a tear down, right?
Tearful. Yeah, yeah. And so in the story, real quick, where the rabbi goes to remove his second shoe, Elijah shows up and says, "Stop. If you remove your second shoe, God will destroy the whole world on your behalf."
Okay.
And Elijah stops him. And there are a lot of stories like this where like God almost seems to overreact to try to calm a rabbi, in a way that's actually more destructive than it is helpful. And I think you can read a similar thing happening in these Hulshat and a lot of these Hulshat dot stories where there seems to be this almost retributive punishment happening to the person who caused someone's madness, someone's Hulshat dot, a weakness of mind. Um, there's another story where a rabbi, some sages are mocking him. And, Halashtate, his mind becomes ill. And another rabbi comes up to him and he's like, you know, I forget the exact words, but he's basically like, please forgive them lest they be punished.
Mhm. Right.
And there's this idea in these stories that the people who are experiencing Hulshat Dat, the specific form of madness, have some sort of agency through their madness. And that if they choose to forgive the person who's offended them, then that person may be healed from whatever retributive punishment thing happened to them, or it can be prevented before they even get hurt. But there often is this like very dramatic cause and effect between someone experiencing illness of mind and the person who made them experience that suffering some sort of consequence. Um, yeah, and the stories there, in some of the stories, we see that there seems to be this idea that if that person who was offended chooses to forgive, then the offender's harm will either be prevented or perhaps healed. So there is this like agency in their madness that's really interesting.
Fascinating. Okay, so because of time, I suggest maybe we move to the next passage. How does
Oh
that
yeah, sorry.
Oh, doing fine. The next passage that you discuss in your paper that you delivered at AJS and also in more detail in your dissertation comes from a much longer pericope. This time it's from a different tractate, Bava Metzia, 83b to 84b. So before reading this text, we should observe that this passage depicts Rabbi Elazar as a collaborator with the Roman authorities.
Yeah,
He assists them in identifying and catching thieves, including Jewish thieves. So we're going to begin in the pericope at the point in the story where Rabbi Elazar's teacher, who is Rabbi Yoshua, confronts him. And then also there's a washerman who's going to reproach Rabbi Elazar. I should also note that you do warn readers in your dissertation when there are references to gore and self-harm, uh,
yeah.
rabbinic texts. So I'm going to just say this right now. Due to some graphic violence, viewer discretion is advised. And
Yes.
I've just fulfilled a childhood dream of being able to say that on TV. I know we're not quite on TV, but we're as close as I'll ever be on television from saying that phrase. But there is going to be some references to gore, self-harm in the passage that we're about to read.
Yes.
I'll just go ahead and read some bits and pieces here of the text and then ask you some questions, let you chime in and comment on this very interesting text. So again, reading from your translation, Rabbi Yehoshua, son of Korha, so this is Elazar's teacher, encountered Elazar and said to him, vinegar, son of wine, which
Yeah.
is, I take that to be an insult that I want to adopt now if I ever remember, vinegar, son of wine.
It's better than the Monty Python, what was it? Your father was a hamster and your mother smelled of elderberry.
I don't know that one. I've only watched one one movie, Life of Brian. So
Okay, yeah,
uh,
this was the Holy Grail movie. Anyway, sorry.
okay, that's great. So vinegar, son of wine, for how long will you hand over the people of God for execution? Eleazar said to him, I am destroying thorns from the vineyard. Yeshua said to him, the owner of the vineyard will come and destroy its thorns. One day, a certain washerman encountered Eleazar and called him, Vinegar, son of wine. Eleazar said, learn from all of that insolence that he is evil. He said to them, capture him, and they captured him, right? So before we move on with the text, uh, Rabbi Elazar reacts differently to the washerman than his teacher, who launches the same insult. Is that significant?
Yeah, it's very significant because this is where we start to realize that status is at play here. You
Okay.
know, I think in the previous story with Yael, it's maybe not as obvious, but you know, as Rav Rahumi's wife, she holds a little bit of status, and he's not respecting it by not coming back and attending to her and giving, you know, his duties as her husband. Um, Here we also see status come into play, I think, much more obviously, and that Rabbi Yehoshua, son of Korcha, is Elazar's teacher. And the washerman isn't even given a name. He's a laborer. Elazar is viewing him as someone below him, someone of lower social status. So for a teacher of who's higher social status than you to reprimand you
Mhm.
is different than someone of lower status reprimanding you. Um, you know, if your parents scold you, even if you're an adult, you're kind of like, okay. But if like your younger sibling does it, you're like, excuse me? Or
Right. And we can, the rabbis also despise certain trades too. I know this just
Yeah.
I wrote once upon a time an article on tanners, people who dress
Oh yeah.
particularly despise that trade. And there's a certain Simon the Tanner in the Acts of the Apostles. And I said, what's going on there? And I came across a lot of interesting rabbinic texts about tanners. And they're like, tanners are no good. I mean, for moral reasons. And I mean, their trade is also just a yucky trade. There's a lot of stench involved
Right,
in it.
don't they use pee or sorry, urine to like in the tanning process?
Rabbinic texts even say they use feces sometimes, so it could be a very smelly business. But right, so this is just the washerman, not even named, and so there's a different rapport between Eleazar here and the washerman, who's accusing him for the same misdeed, right? Just
Yeah.
with the same insult as his teacher, but he responds differently to his teacher. He tries to, I guess, defend his position before his teacher by saying, "Well, I'm basically taking the thorns away," and the teacher, Rabbi Yeshua, says, "Well, that let the owner of the vineyard." I take that to mean God, basically, right? Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, because the thorns are like the thieves. The
Uh,
vineyard, the Eleazar is arresting for the Romans. The vineyard is the Jewish people. And yeah, God is the owner of the vineyard. So he's like, let God exact that judgment. Don't work for the Romans and arrest your own people. Um and yeah, you almost like Eleazar is like engaging with him almost in like a halakhic sort of debate, or maybe in this case a theological debate, if you will. Um and so there's a level of respect there. You know, he's pushing back and arguing his point, but he's doing so respectfully and almost, you know, in a very rabbinic style way. When the washerman says this to him, he's like, oh, this guy's evil. And he has the Romans arrest him, even
right,
though he's not a thief, as far as we know. He just insulted Rabbi Elazar.
right. When he says capture him, and they captured him, presumably that means the
The
Romans
Romans.
captured him, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the text goes on. It says, after his da'at had rested, right? So here we have the word da'at, which appears in the phrase you analyze in your research, hushat da'at. So here, da'at appears with the verb to rest. After his da'at had rested, he gathered money to redeem him. So the washerman we're talking about, but
Yeah.
was not able to do so. He recited this verse about him, quote, he who guards his mouth and tongue guards his nephesh, which can mean soul or self, from distress or from pain, end quote. This is taken from the book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 23. So this part of the passage states that Eleazar's mind, if we're going to translate da'at, his mind, rested. Then Eleazar quotes Proverbs 21:23, which contains the word nephesh. Is there a connection between da'at and nephesh? If so, could you tell us a little bit about this and what this tells us about how the rabbis see the relationship between mind and body?
Yeah. So, nefesh, I think as you already said, it's normally translated soul, but or sometimes self. And it can also mean breath, and that has a more physical element to it because you can like feel a breath on your hand. You can, there's a physicality. You have to inhale and exhale to give out a breath. There's a physicality to it. And I do in this story, body, mind, soul, emotions, they're all very intertwined in and with one another. Um, and in my dissertation and in hopefully another forthcoming article that I'm working on right now, I dig into the embodiment that is at play in this story. Um, and yeah, and I don't necessarily know if, soul and mind aren't necessarily like interchangeable, but there's definitely like there's some very interesting like connections and links between the two in the way that the rabbis are using them and telling this story. And they also seem to be very physical. A lot of times, even when we talk about, for example, disabilities, we talk about physical versus mental disabilities. We tend to forget that the brain is a physical organ and that there are chemicals that are affecting our emotions and how we perceive the world that are going on in our body. And that even things, like anxiety, you experience it physically in your body too. And that we can tend to try to bifurcate emotions and mind from physical and body. But one thing that MAD and disability studies both do a great job of reminding us is that the two are much more intertwined than we sometimes like to admit. And we see something very similar and interesting going on in this story.
Right. Yeah. Like when I first learned the biblical Hebrew, and encountered the word nephesh in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, I was taught that the nephesh is not to think of the nephesh, excuse me, in this dualistic way of
Right.
soul versus body. There's a much more holistic view of the nephesh as being the self, which is the body of soul,
Mhm.
of course. And there's a continuity in that perspective in the rabbinic view between
Yeah.
the Bible and the Talmud in that regard. So shall we move on? Should we keep on
Yeah.
reading? So the text goes on. It says they hung him. So they hung the washerman. Eleazar stood below the gallows weeping. That is the other rabbis, said to him, Rabbi, do not let this shatter you. He and his son had sex with an engaged young woman on Yom Kippur at the same time. He rested his hand, and the word rested here, you do highlight this in brackets. Hiniach is from the same root as when his mind had rested earlier after he got angry with the washerman. So just pointing that out there. So he rested his hand on his internal organs, saying, "Rejoice, internal organs, rejoice. Just as your doubts are correct, how much more so are your certainties? I trust in you that no maggot or worm will rule over you." All right. So I believe Daniel Boyarin, and you mentioned Daniel Boyarin in your own research, views such stories as grotesque satire because it's going to talks about organs, and as we read on, some yucky things are done with the organs. There's pus, there's fat, and so on. But you
Yeah.
read this a little differently, correct?
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of these things, just as how in mad studies you can be a consumer, a survivor, and an ex-psychiatric patient all at the same time. So too in the Talmud, multiple things can be true at the same time. I think that's one of the things that also really drew me to mad studies is there seems to be this similar way of viewing the world. Um, and so I don't mean to say that Daniel Barreran's reading is incorrect, but I do think there is another reading that can be made of these texts that will also give us like historical insight. And that's that. And again, I keep going back to this like reading the story at face value, but I don't think the story is satire. At least not in the way that I read it. Um, I see a man who's like really distressed and really confused. Rabbi Elazar, will read like he never explicitly experiences Hulshat Da'at. They never say Chalash Da'ate, his mind became ill, but his mind is constantly resting and being unrested. It's constantly being settled and unsettled. And then they keep emphasizing these words by like what we already saw. He rested his hand. It's the same verb as like once his mind had rested. Um, he seems to be on this kind of like emotional roller coaster throughout the whole story. And while some of what he does seems rather fantastical to us and might even be read as satire, um, I'm not convinced that's the only way to read these stories, and I think we can really glean some important historical insights if we just take them seriously. Not that saying something is satire isn't taking it seriously, but I think you get what I'm saying of like, no, this is a rabbi who's really he's going through it.
Right.
Uh,
70 faces to the Torah, as the rabbinic dictum goes, I guess. There's different ways of reading the same text.
yeah,
So you're taking this text at face value, which I guess we haven't really reached the point where it becomes very striking what Rabbi Elazar does
yeah,
to his body here. So maybe we should go on and read that, and then
yeah,
talk a bit more about this passage. So coming back to the text, it says, but even so, his da'at was not settled, right? So he became reassured because these rabbis said, don't worry. He was feeling guilty, correct? He had delivered this washerman to the Romans because he was angry. When his anger had settled down, sort of, he tried to redeem him, but was unable to redeem him. So this washerman ended up being hung, maybe crucified by the Romans, and so he's clearly now in distress about that. He's even weeping, the text says, and the rabbis they try to reassure him, saying, hey, well, he engaged in illicit sexual relations for the rabbis. Add to that on Yom Kippur, which is a day where
right. With his father, right? Or with his son, I forget.
was engaged with a young woman. Yeah, he and his son had sex with an engaged woman, right? So there's a multiple sexual relations that are listed here that are being transgressed on the holiest day of the Jewish year.
Yeah, yeah. So they're saying, don't worry, he deserved to be executed, is basically what they're saying. Their words, not mine.
Right.
But yeah, so that's their comfort. They're like, you didn't know it, but he did actually deserve capital punishment. They're trying to reassure him with this.
And at first, it seems like he's reassured because it says
Yeah.
he rested his hand on his internal organs and says, rejoice, organs. But now, coming back to the text, it says, even so, his da'at was not settled. They gave him sleep medicine, brought him to a marble house, and cut open his belly. So this is where we're talking about the viewer discretion being advised.
Yeah.
They took out from him his baskets, out from him baskets of abdominal fat, and set them in the sun in Tammuz and Av. So these are the names of months, right? Of the
Yeah, the two hottest months of the summer.
right. So we'd say maybe July and August here in the Midwest
Yeah.
of the United States, and they did not decompose, right? So they're taking out his guts, putting it out to the sun to fry under the sun, it seems, and it did not decompose. The Talmud's anonymous editorial voice interrupts the narrative to raise an objection here. So the Talmud says, but not all abdominal fat decomposes. uh, uh, And the Talmud, again, talking here in an anonymous way, says, well, all abdominal fat that has red veins in it decomposes, but despite the fact that it had red veins in it, it did not decompose.
Right. So, right, like, because the story is like, oh, this miraculous or like unexpected thing happened where none of the fat decomposed. And then the Talmud is like, well, wait a minute, but fat, not all fat does decompose. And then they're like, oh, no, 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 it's okay because red veins do.
Right, right. The
Yeah,
Talmud, like, this is maybe not such a big deal because there is fat that doesn't decompose, but then it goes back and says, well, this is fat with red veins. Uh,
right.
it's not decomposing, so it is extraordinary after all.
Yeah,
So coming back to the text, Rabbi Elazar recited about his nafsha, which we could translate here about himself or his person, the verse from Psalm 16, verse 9, which says, "Therefore my heart was glad and my honor rejoiced. Also my flesh will settle in trustworthiness." But even so, Rabbi Elazar Bar Shimon did not rely or lean on his nafsha. It is like, I think, a roller coaster trip here with
yeah,
Rabbi Elazar's emotions, as you were stating earlier, because he was angry at the washerman, then he settled down, then he tried to redeem the washerman, didn't succeed, the washerman got crucified, then he was weeping, then he was reassured, but then he wasn't reassured, so they cut out his guts. Now he's reciting something about his nafsha, about himself, which seems to be commendable because he's quoting from the Bible, from Psalm 69. But nevertheless, he still didn't rely on his nafsha, right? So it's a lot of back and forth here. Uh,
right. And again, we see that play between da'at and nefesh, right? Nafsha is the Aramaic for nefesh, soul. So right, we were like, he didn't rely on his da'at, and now he's not relying on basically his soul or himself. Again, there's that interchange going on.
Very nice. So in case, God forbid, this incident happened by his hands, he received upon himself sufferings. Each day at night, they gave him 60 felt cloths, and they would bring out from beneath him 60 basins of blood and pus. Uh,
Yeah.
so it sounds like he's doing something to his body, right? Punishing
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah, this is where like the self-harm warning comes in because um yeah, it's very vague. The text doesn't really, is it self-flagellation? Is it more mystical? Like, is he like, maybe he is just saying out, like I think we read on, he says, my brothers and my friends come, addressing his sufferings, like he invites them, and then maybe his body just starts producing more blood and pus. It's unclear.
Okay.
But there is some, like, he is somehow actively making his body go through these physical sufferings.
Right. In any case, the text goes on to say, and his house, you provide the literal translation, meaning his wife,
Yeah.
made him 60 types of fig-based dishes and fed him. And she, that is his house, would not give him leave to go out of the study house, the livei midrasha in the Aramaic, so that the rabbis would not press him. At night, he said to them, my brothers and my friends come, as you were alluding to just earlier. In the morning, he said to them, my brothers and my friends, leave. So here you name also the wife of the rabbinic sage in question, Elazar here, Batya, correct?
Yeah.
What led you to choose this particular name for this?
Yeah. Well, I kind of was following the rabbi's lead in that Batya almost has the exact same consonants as Bete. It's just changing the vowels. And I think there's like an extra yud or not. But Batya is a Hebrew name that means God's daughter, daughter of God. And so I kind of took what she's referred to in the Talmud of his house and changed it to no, this woman is one of God's daughters. Like, she is a human, she is important. Let's give her a name and her due. While also acknowledging house really comes into play. The word bite is really important as the story unfolds. And so I think it's kind of a fun way to retain that a little bit in the consonants while still ascribing her back her humanity and agency.
Very nice. Right. So for people who may not know Hebrew, we have in Hebrew bait, which is house, and bat, which means daughter, right? And so you're doing this creative wordplay,
Yeah.
original wordplay between bait and bat, and giving her the name Bat Yah, daughter of Yah, one of the syllables for the holy name of God. Um, okay. So one day his house heard him. She said to him, "You are bringing them upon yourself. You are diminishing the money of my father's house," referring to her dowry. She deserted him and went to her father's house. So it sounds like, well, maybe here, I don't know what you think, Hannah. At least Batya is blaming Eleazar for what's happening to his body.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some really interesting, and I analyze this in my dissertation, from a feminist studies perspective, she as the woman has been burdened with caring for her husband. From like a disability and mad studies perspective, um she's kind of abusing her role as caretaker over him. Because when you're a caretaker, you have some power over the person you're taking care of. She's trying to force his hand here. She's saying, I'm going to leave. And then what are you going to do? You can't keep taking these sufferings on yourself because no one's there to take care of you afterwards. And in that sense, is a very irresponsible thing to do. But also as like a woman women are also like socialized into these caretaking roles. Um, she's doing something very liberating and saying, I'm done with this, I'm leaving. So there's this really complex power dynamics going on here between the couple in this moment. Yeah.
Okay. So she goes to her father's house. So next the story says 60 sailors rose up and came and brought him, so Eleazar, 60 slaves, each of which handed over 60 purses and made him 60 types of pap, and he ate them.
Yeah.
One, yeah,
And again, you also see in my this also is very interesting because in modern times it's often like, especially like in America, it's often immigrants or people of color who are like put in like these like caretaking roles as well and professions. And so like it's very significant that like once his wife leaves, now it's 60 slaves that are taking care of him. It really like, and there's not time to like get into that here, and like break down all those nuances, but there's a lot of interesting things going on with power dynamics and social status and positions within like this ancient society.
okay, very interesting.
Yeah.
So one day she said to her daughter, "Go and see what your father is doing." So this is the wife, of course, now sending her daughter. So she went. He said to her, "Ours is greater than theirs." He recited the biblical verse about his nafsha, so about himself. From this is a quotation from Proverbs 31:14 to 15. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and gives food to her household. Maybe you can comment here a little bit about Eleazar's attitude. What's going on?
Yeah, this is great. This is where the story gets fun, in my opinion. But Eleazar is like she's there. It's also fascinating that their daughter's the go-between. There's like this messenger thing going on. Um, we didn't know they had a daughter until this moment, but now we know. I should have given the daughter a name. I didn't think to do that.
Just thinking daughter, bots, right?
Yeah.
This is the
I
bot.
should have also named the washerman. I didn't name him either. Anyways,
Mhm.
so things to fix in the article.
You
Uh
60 sailors too. You can come up with 60 names.
60 names and the slaves and the names for the 60s. Um he's reciting this verse. It comes from uh this passage in the book of Proverbs that like praises what like a good wife does and has come to be known as a passage called the Woman of Valor, that even today at Shabbat dinners in some Jewish households, the husband of the house will recite to honor the wife. I have very complicated feelings about that practice that we don't have time to go into. But in this moment, Eleazar is saying, like, I don't need you. I can kind of fulfill the role of husband and wife. I'm the woman of valor. I'm the Bait. I'm the Bete, as well as the A in Bete, right? I am his as well as his wife. And he's almost like, yeah, he's kind of claiming the power and agency that she had in her role as wife and like caretaker.
Yeah, so then reading on with the text, there's I think maybe some more wordplay here with this notion of bayit, because it says one day he went to the Beit Midrasha, the study house. Right? So the Beit Midrash, we have Beit
Right.
goes to the study house. They brought before him 60 types of blood. He declared all of them ritually pure. The rabbis were murmuring about him, saying, is it possible that not one of them is uncertain? He said to them, if it's in accordance with me, let them all, the children birthed by the woman who sent the blood samples, be males. And if it's not, let there be one female among them. They were all males, and they, that is their parents, named them after Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yehuda, the patriarch, said, how much of Israel's propagation has this evil person, Batia, annulled? So
Yeah.
why is she called evil here by Rabbi Yehuda?
Yeah. So what's going on is when it's basically when they say they brought before him 60 types of blood. It's a practice that some Jewish communities still practice today, where women will take samples of the blood that comes out of their vagina or their vulva, and they'll take it to the rabbis, their local rabbi, and their rabbi will rule on whether it's menstrual blood or not.
And why is
Because
that important? Yeah.
yeah, if it's menstrual blood, then you're ritually impure and you can't have sex until you've stopped bleeding, until your menstrual cycle has stopped and you've gone through a mikvah and ritually immersed and cleansed yourself, and then you can have sex again. So there's this issue of if you're menstruating, especially if your menstrual cycle is a little bit irregular, um, how are you going to get pregnant? Because you like can't have sex because you're constantly in this state of ritual impurity. And a lot of things can cause ritual impurity. A seminal emission in the night can also cause ritual impurity. It's not just women's menstrual cycle that makes this an issue. But in this case, they're bringing 60 women, bring him 60 samples of blood and say, is this menstrual blood? And he rules them ritually pure. He says, this isn't menstrual blood. You can still have sex. And, the rabbis are like, how is it possible that all 60 of these samples aren't menstrual blood? Right. It's kind of ludicrous. And he like kind of puts it to the test. And he's like, if I'm right, then all of the children born from the sex they can now go have will be male. And they're all male and they're all named after him. And it's this really bizarre and kind of creative moment of reproduction and legacy, which is very important for the rabbis. Because basically, Rabbi Elazar, without having any sex himself, has produced a bunch of mini-me's, right? All these baby boys named after him. Uh, it's really a fascinating moment. And there's this power he's enacting over women and their reproductive organs. And that's where the other meaning of bait, which is they use house and architectural imagery, the rabbis do, to describe women's sexual and reproductive anatomy. And so a woman's uterus is often referred to as a bait, her bait. Um, and I think this other meaning of bite and house is coming into play here.
And is there an unsaid preference for having a boy versus a daughter here when Rabbi?
Oh yeah, extremely so. There's actually another rabbi finds he has a son and his mind goes ill, halash da'ateh, because of it in another story.
Son or a daughter?
Oh, sorry, you're right, daughter. Thank you for catching my slip up.
Um,
Yeah, he doesn't have a son, he has a daughter, and he goes mad because of it, right? There's this idea that sons are better than daughters, unfortunately. And so Rabbi Yehuda's calling Batya evil here because when Rabbi Elazar was having these nightly sufferings and she was healing him every morning, she wasn't letting him go to the Beit Midrash. Now he can go and make this ruling, and suddenly there's 60 new baby boys. So how many boys did she prevent being born when she didn't let her husband? And so you see Eleazar really exercising what I call uterine power. And that he's now the woman of the house. He's the bayit, the wife, the uterus, right? If you think about the three meanings of this word bayit. And then he goes to the study house, another bayit, and like makes this ruling over these women's like vaginal emissions and or uterine emissions and like brings about the procreation of 60 boys. So he's really kind of taking over both and he's also exercising all of this in the Beit Midrash, which I kind of talk about as like the seat of Da'at power, because that's where you're doing the studying, the intellectual engagement, you're exercising your Da'at, right? Your mind, your knowledge, your opinions. And so Eleazar is kind of taking like both seats of power here in this moment.
Fascinating. So I think we're almost near the end of the pericope here, the story. So let's maybe just read on. When Rabbi Elazar's nafsha, so his soul, we might say, was resting. Again, the word rest appears here. So in other words, he was dying. He said to his house, "I know that the rabbis are angry with me and will not properly tend to me upon my death. Lay me down in my attic and do not be afraid of me." Rabbi Shmuel, son of Nachmani, said, "The mother of Rabbi Yochanan told me that the house of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, told her not less than 18 and not more than 22 years that he slept in his attic. Every day I would go up and inspect his hair. When a hair would fall off, blood would come. One day I saw a creeping thing come out of his ear. My mind became ill." And we have the phrase here, halasha data. So her mind became ill or weak.
Yeah.
Um, he appeared to me in a dream and said to me, "It's nothing. One day I heard something disgraceful about a rabbinical student, and I did not protest as was required of me." Um, so in your paper and your dissertation, you do comment on Batya's mental illness or her state of mind here. Why does she become ill? And why is she reassured once Elazar appears to her in a dream?
Yeah, so what's going on here is um this really fascinating thing where Rabbi Elazar has been proving like the accuracy and strength and trustworthiness of his dot through these physical tests, right? His flesh did not decompose in that surgery. And also he didn't die from the surgery, which in and of itself seems like a big deal to at least modern readers. I don't know about the ancient readers, but so it's also significant that when his body is being stored in the attic of their house, his body seems to also not be decomposing. A hair falls off and blood coming means that like there's still life, right? Like lifeblood. He's dead, but I have a little fun with it and call him undead in my dissertation. He's like a little zombie or vampire or something. Up there where he's dead, his soul is asleep, but his body seems to still be alive.
I think I'm thinking of a deactivated golem in the attic
Yes,
synagogue in Prague.
yes, yeah. And we have him in the attic, just as in the other story, Rav Rahumi was studying on the roof. Like there's this interesting theme of houses and heights and um yeah, it's really fascinating. Um, and so one day she sees a creeping thing, and I purposely translated it this way because it's different. Earlier, Rabbi Elazar says to his guts, his abdominal organs, like, "Oh, no worm or maggot will rule over you." And it is a different word here that you can translate as bug or worm or just a creepy thing, a creepy crawly. But it seems to be hearkening back to that nevertheless, of a worm crawling out of his ear. She thinks it's a sign that his body is decomposing. Now, at first glance, I think you read this and you're like, oh, obviously seeing your husband's body decomposing is gonna be distressing.
Right.
But when you look further, there's more at play here, where she once again, and I don't remember how, if do we read the rest of it?
I,
No, well, if you keep reading, you'll see that she ends the story with both the power of Da'at and the power of Bait, be that house, uterus, her power as a social status as a wife. Um, because once again, her husband is in her house. Um, and she's taking care of his body. And you'll also read further on in the story. I guess I'm giving some spoilers. Uh, I don't think we have time to like finish it today, but um people would come with their disputes beneath the attic door, and Ella's and a disembodied voice, um presumably Elazar's voice would descend and give education. Uh or like, you're right, you're wrong, this is how you resolve the issue. So he's still acting as a rabbi, even though he's dead, but not rotting in her attic. And you get this idea that like now the Beit Midrash is in Batya's house. It's in her attic. She has control not only of her household again, but also over the Beit Midrash, and she gets the Da'at power and the uterine power. In this really fascinating ending of the story. Um, and so in this moment, when she sees her husband's rotting corpse, there's a fear that she's gonna lose that.
mm,
Because if he's decomposing, then maybe he'll no longer be able to, do his rabbi thing with his disembodied voice, um, to people coming for adjudication. And she might lose that control she has over the Beit Midrash, over this other like seat of power. And I think that's what's going on here in this moment. Um, and and she's reassured because when Elazar appears to her, he's like, "Oh, my body isn't decomposing. There's a worm in my ear as punishment for this other sin I committed." um, which is he heard someone gossiping about a rabbi, a rabbinical student, and he did not protest. So now he's being punished by there being a worm in his ear.
so
um,
words you're saying, the Batya here, it's not that, of course, if you see the body of a loved one decomposing, I can
right.
imagine that would be a devastating thing to experience, and you could experience weakness of mind at that moment. But
Yeah.
in addition, she has a role here that, if I understand correctly, is interconnected with her husband's body not decomposing. As long as the body does not decompose, then presumably this undead person, as you put it,
Yeah.
continue to educate, can continue to provide rulings to people who come to Batya's house. But Batya's the one who is the maybe doorkeeper, the gatekeeper here of the
Yeah,
house.
yeah. Before she stopped her husband from going, but now she controls who goes and who comes completely.
She's running a Beit Midrash of
Yeah.
sorts. And
Yeah.
she's worried now that might end, and so she experiences weakness of mind in that way.
Yeah.
Hannah, it's been so enjoyable doing this interview with you.
Yeah.
Uh, what are your next plans for your dissertation, which is currently on embargo?
Yeah, yeah. So for those who don't know, I chose to embargo it, which means it's not going to be published just yet. And that's because, yeah, I want to write at least two articles from this. This was all chapter one and a conference paper. Um, and I didn't have time to talk about the woman I named Jael and Rav Rachumi in my dissertation, but I'd love to bring it into conversation with this story of Elazar and Batya in an article and really get into the analyzing the intricacies of like gender and embodiment and madness that's going on in these stories and social status. I also think I want to do another article just on the elements of embodiment that are going on in this story. And we touched on it a little bit with like soul, nefesh versus da, mind, and maybe it not being as binary as mind and body being separate things. And so yeah, I'm hoping to do another article on this story where I talk about the embodiment going on in the narrative.
Well, Hannah, thanks again so much for sharing your time and expertise. Congratulations again on completing your dissertation, getting your PhD from the one and only University of Michigan, and best of wishes to your with the progress of your research. I hope to see publications in the near future of your dissertation. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.